Good evening, everyone. Warm welcome to Overseas Press Club members, supporters of PEN, China Hands, and others in the audience who are interested in press freedom and writers' freedom. I'm Minky Worden. I'm on the board of the Overseas Press Club. I'm a dedicated supporter of PEN, and I work as my day job at Human Rights Watch. And I also lived and worked in Hong Kong, so I have a strong interest in the report that we're going to present tonight. I wanted to say a few words first, if I may, about the work of the Overseas Press Club. For those of you who don't know the organization, we've been around for more than 75 years. We are dedicated to defending foreign correspondents around the world, to expanding their work and to honoring their work. We also have a foundation that provides scholarships for recent journalism grads to become foreign correspondents, to move to Beijing or Hanoi or Bukavu, to learn the craft and to spend a career as a foreign correspondent. The organization PEN has done extraordinary work on press freedom around the world. The organization did a fantastic report in January of 2015 called Threatened Harbor about press freedom and the threats to publishing in, about press freedom and the threats to publishing in Hong Kong. That report that PEN put out was actually well in advance of the 5 publishers who were abducted, including from Hong Kong last year in 2015. So I think we're discussing the topic at a very important time. This is the report, darkened screen. I hope everyone's got a copy of it. I'm going to first introduce Suzanne Nossel to walk you through the findings of this report. You should read an outstanding story in the New York Times business section today about the report by Ian Johnson that goes through the findings of it. But we're very fortunate to have Suzanne Nossel with us today. She's the executive director of PEN and is a great defender of press freedom and the freedom of to write. Thank you, Suzanne.
Thank you so much, Minky. Thanks so much, Minky. Minky is a great friend to PEN and a great friend to China and to Hong Kong and a great friend to me. So extremely grateful to be here with her tonight and with our distinguished panel. This report really grew out of a trip that we made to China in the beginning of 2015 with a couple of different PEN writers, including Art Spiegelman and Susan Orlean, and we had meetings with all kinds of different groups, authors, dissidents, lawyers, and we also met with foreign journalists, including Gotti and Ed when they were there. And as PEN, we've always worked on many cases of Chinese writers who are under pressure or in jail. Liu Xiaobo is the president of the Independent Chinese PEN Center, was members of PEN and leaders of PEN who were at the forefront of the call for him to win the 2011 Nobel Peace Prize. And so China's always been very close to PEN's heart, and we still remain very much focused on the situation of Chinese writers and the repression that they face, but we recognize that there was another story that needed to be told, and it centered around the critical role that foreign journalists play in providing an essential window into China. And it's a window that informs diplomacy, trade, corporate engagement, cultural engagement, educational engagement. And it's really the way so many of us know so much of what we know about China is thanks to dedicated, intrepid journalists who have gone and ferreted out the stories. And as China's become so much more important on the world stage, their work has become increasingly essential. And what we learned was that they are facing greater and greater pressures, particularly under Xi Jinping. And we wanted to document that and draw attention to the ways in which their space to operate is being constricted and the risk that that poses for the information that all of us rely upon to make such crucial decisions when it comes to engagement with China. And so we worked with a researcher. We interviewed more than 36 journalists who've worked in China, and we document in the report a whole series of forms of pressure and pressure tactics that the Chinese government is applying. One that's received a lot of attention is around visa denials and the arbitrary refusal to renew visas, delays in visa approvals, retaliatory unwillingness to renew visas for journalists who've taken on some of the most hard-hitting and sensitive stories, but also more direct and menacing tactics, including harassment of journalists and their families, direct threats made to journalists sitting in rooms with Chinese officials and being told, what to write about and what not to write about. Discussions about which media outlets and which journalists are considered exemplary because they follow the rules. They've been willing to pull back on certain stories, and the Chinese government now expects that from others. We talk about also the really dangerous harassment faced by news assistants, so the Chinese nationals who work with foreign journalists and who provide them with the essential service of sometimes language, but also local knowledge, connections, the ability to set up meetings and interviews so that they can carry out their work. Those individuals can be most at risk because they're Chinese nationals, and the sense of caution that the Chinese government may have in relation to Western journalists whose fates get a lot of attention, who are employees of major foreign media companies. That's not necessarily the case with news assistants, and we talk in particular about one really egregious case of detention and disappearance of a news assistant and tactics that may amount to torture, sleep deprivation, hooding. So that too has a chilling effect on the ability of journalists to feel like they can work with news assistants and ensure their security as that work is carried out. We also talk about the narrowing range of topics that the Chinese government is willing to allow foreign journalists to probe into. Xi Jinping's image has become very sensitive. Corruption has become incredibly sensitive. The government is also withdrawing types of information that used to be more readily accessible. They're putting in pressure on sources that have talked to journalists in the past, but now feel that doing so would incur great risk for them. And then finally, we talk about Western media companies and how they're responding to this. And there have been reports in the media that I'm sure many of you are familiar with about what happened with Bloomberg after they did a series of hard-hitting exposés, and they were directly threatened in terms of the fate of their terminal business in China, which is the very lucrative and much larger portion of their business, and very open statements that their leadership made about restricting the scope of their coverage to focus on business issues and to avoid hard-hitting exposés. And what we found was, while it's not that widespread, there are other worrisome trends in terms of how media outlets are drawing the parameters of their coverage and what they will and won't authorize their journalists to look into. And that can be a very sort of neutral seeming way to avoid controversy, but what it means is that certain topics really become out of bounds and off limits. We also talk about Reuters in particular having adopted, according to several sources that we spoke to, a new protocol whereby their stories to do with certain sensitive topics are subject to additional layers of review. And there's a special process that they've adopted, we've been told, where those stories are really heavily scrutinized, and the result has been fewer stories on sensitive topics like human rights issues. We also took a look at one kind of additional service that foreign journalists in China play is being a lifeline to the Chinese citizenry. With Chinese domestic media so heavily constricted, even though many of the websites of foreign media outlets are difficult to access, it may require going through a firewall, many of those websites are blocked. Still, this information does get through in some cases, and it provides an important outside perspective. And what we found taking a look at the Chinese language media, the Chinese language websites of different media outlets, was that in some cases there seemed to be a pretty clear pattern of the most hard-hitting and sensitive stories that were being published globally not being translated into Chinese, so that the Chinese population never gets to see those stories. A final note I'll add is that these measures are accompanied by kind of a softer, maybe harder to document, but still perceptible if you read through the report, effort by the Chinese government to cast the foreign media as an agent of the West, perhaps of the United States government, coming to China with an agenda to cast a certain light on that country. And I think that effort to portray the foreign media in that light has had some effect in terms of discrediting the foreign media as a source of information for the Chinese citizenry. And it's another piece of the puzzle in terms of how Xi Jinping's government is trying to push back against and constrict the role and the influence of foreign media. So that's a quick overview, but really this panel knows much more about these topics than I do. So I am delighted to turn the conversation over to you.